I was lying on the kitchen floor, gasping for air, watching my husband and sister stand over me with cold eyes. But what they didn't know was, I'd switched the glasses 3 hours earlier. Now, before I tell you how I outsmarted the two people I trusted most in this world, let me take you back to where it all began. Because this story, this betrayal, it didn't happen overnight. It was carefully planned, meticulously executed, and it almost worked. Almost. My name is Margaret Chin, and 6 months ago I had what everyone called the perfect life. At 42 years old, I was a successful pharmaceutical researcher, the kind of woman who spent her days in lab coats developing medications that could save lives. I specialized in cardiac drugs, and after years of research, my team was on the verge of something incredible. A new medication that could revolutionize treatment for heart failure. We were just months away from FDA approval, and I was proud. So incredibly proud of what we'd built. But my real pride, or so I thought, was my marriage. 15 years with David Chin, a charming real estate developer who knew how to light up a room the moment he walked in. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world when he looked at you. Dark hair that was just starting to silver at the temples, a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and a voice that could soothe any worry. We'd built a beautiful home together in the suburbs, the kind with a wraparound porch and a garden I tended every weekend. We talked about children once, but my career had taken off and somehow the timing never felt right. David said he understood. He said my work was important, that he was proud of me. And then there was Claire, my baby sister. 3 years younger than me and in so many ways my opposite. Where I was methodical and careful, Claire was spontaneous and free-spirited. She had honey blonde hair that she wore long and loose, green eyes that sparkled when she laughed, and a personality that drew people to her like moths to a flame. Growing up, I'd always protected her. When kids at school bullied her, I was the one who stepped in. When she needed money for art school, I was the one who helped. When her marriage fell apart 8 months before all of this happened, I was the one who opened my door and said, "Stay as long as you need." That decision would nearly cost me my life. Claire had married young to a man named Brandon, a musician who spent more time chasing dreams than holding down jobs. After 5 years, she'd finally had enough and filed for divorce. She showed up at my door with 3 suitcases and tears streaming down her face, and my heart broke for her. David and I welcomed her in. We set up the guest room, made space in our lives, tried to help her heal. She said she just needed a few months to get back on her feet, to find a job, to figure out her next chapter. I didn't know I was inviting a viper into my nest. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. Normal even. Claire would cook dinner sometimes, and the 3 of us would sit around the table sharing stories about our days. She'd gotten a job at a boutique downtown, nothing fancy, but it gave her purpose. She'd go out with friends on weekends. David would joke with her and she'd laugh, and I'd think how lucky I was to have the 2 people I loved most under one roof. But then slowly things started to change. And I mean slowly. So slowly that I couldn't pinpoint when it actually began. It was like watching a photograph fade in the sun. You don't notice it day by day, but one morning you look at it and realize it's not what it used to be. I started feeling tired. Exhausted, really, in a way I'd never experienced before. I'd wake up after 8 hours of sleep feeling like I hadn't slept at all. At first I blamed it on work. The FDA approval process was stressful and I was putting in long hours at the lab. But then came the nausea. I'd be in the middle of a meeting and suddenly have to excuse myself to run to the bathroom. My stomach would cramp and twist, and I'd spend 20 minutes hunched over the toilet, wondering what I'd eaten. The dizziness started next. I'd stand up from my desk and the room would spin. Twice I actually had to grab onto the wall to keep from falling. My colleagues noticed. My boss, Dr. Raymond, pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, just stressed. He suggested I see a doctor, maybe take a few days off. I laughed it off. I didn't have time to be sick. We were too close to the finish line with our research. But the symptoms didn't go away. They got worse. I started having headaches that felt like someone was driving nails into my skull. My hands would tremble when I tried to hold a pipette. I'd forget things. Simple things like where I'd put my car keys or what I'd gone to the grocery store to buy. One morning I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. My skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Dark circles shadowed my eyes. I'd lost weight without trying, my clothes hanging loose on my frame. David insisted I see a doctor. He made the appointment himself, drove me there, held my hand in the waiting room. I remember feeling so grateful for his concern, for the way he stayed by my side. The doctor ran tests. Blood work, urine samples, even an MRI. Everything came back normal. Completely, frustratingly normal. The doctor suggested it might be stress-related. Perhaps early perimenopause. He recommended rest, maybe some therapy to deal with work pressure. He prescribed vitamins and sent me home. Claire was so sympathetic. She'd make me special herbal teas in the evening, saying they'd help me relax. She'd rub my shoulders when the headaches got bad. She'd take over the household chores I was too exhausted to do. David would come home from work early to check on me. They both kept telling me to take it easy, to let them take care of me. And I did. I let my guard down completely because these were the two people I trusted most in the world. My husband, my sister. Why would I ever suspect them? I confided everything in them. Every symptom, every fear, every worry about my health. When I couldn't sleep at night, it was Claire I'd talk to in the kitchen over chamomile tea. When I cried in frustration about the doctors finding nothing wrong, it was David who held me and promised we'd figure it out together. I was vulnerable and I was open, and I was so stupid. The small things started piling up around the 3-month mark of my illness. Little things that individually meant nothing but together formed a picture I didn't want to see. I noticed Claire wearing my jewelry one day, a necklace David had given me for our 10th anniversary. When I mentioned it, she laughed and said I'd told her she could borrow it. Had I? I couldn't remember. My memory had become so unreliable lately. I'd catch glimpses of David texting and he'd quickly put his phone away when I entered the room. When I asked who he was talking to, he'd say clients or his brother. His explanations were always reasonable, always delivered with that warm smile, but something felt off. He'd started coming home later from work, saying he had showings or meetings. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Then came the day I found the mortgage papers. I was looking for our tax documents in David's home office. We were coming up on filing deadline, and I found a folder I didn't recognize. Inside were papers for a second mortgage on our house. $200,000. The signature that was supposed to be mine looked nothing like my handwriting, but there it was, notarized and official. $200,000 taken out against our home, and I knew nothing about it. My hands shook as I held those papers. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. When David came home that evening, I confronted him. I put the papers on the kitchen table and asked him to explain. Claire was there too, sitting at the breakfast bar with a glass of wine, and I watched her face carefully as David stumbled through his explanation. He said it was an investment opportunity. A property deal that was too good to pass up. He said he'd tried to tell me about it, but I'd been so sick, so stressed that he didn't want to burden me. He said he'd forged my signature because he knew I'd approve it anyway and he'd needed to move quickly. He was sorry. He should have told me. But the deal was already paying dividends and soon we'd have even more money than before. The thing is, he was so convincing. He'd always been good with words, good at making you see things his way. And I was so tired, so worn down by months of feeling awful, that part of me wanted to believe him. Part of me wanted to just let it go and trust that my husband of 15 years knew what he was doing. But another part of me, a small voice in the back of my mind, whispered that something was very, very wrong. Claire jumped in to defend him. She put her hand on my arm and said David was just trying to take care of us, that I was being paranoid. That word, paranoid. It stung. Was I being paranoid? Or was I finally starting to see clearly for the first time in months? That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to David, listening to him breathe, and I felt like I was sleeping next to a stranger. Around 2 a.m, I got up to get some water. As I walked past the guest room, I heard voices. Low voices trying to be quiet. I stopped, pressed my ear to the door. David and Claire. What was David doing in Claire's room at 2 a.m? I couldn't make out the words, just the tone. Intimate. Familiar. The kind of tone you use with someone you're close to. I stood there in the dark hallway, my heart sinking, and I knew. Somewhere deep in my gut I knew. But I wasn't ready to face it yet. I walked back to my bedroom, climbed into bed, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The next morning I pretended everything was normal. I made breakfast. I kissed David goodbye when he left for work. I chatted with Claire about her day. But inside I was screaming. I started watching them more carefully after that. Really watching. And once I knew what to look for, the signs were everywhere. The way Claire would touch David's arm when she talked to him, her hand lingering just a second too long. The way David would look at her when he thought I wasn't paying attention. A look that was far too warm, far too familiar. The inside jokes they'd developed. The times I'd walk into a room and their conversation would stop abruptly. The way they'd both immediately look at me with these bright fake smiles and ask how I was feeling. I started keeping a journal documenting everything. Times, dates, observations. I felt crazy doing it, like some paranoid housewife in a bad movie. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something huge, something that was right in front of my face. My best friend Rita came over one afternoon. We'd known each other since college and she'd always been able to read me like a book. She took one look at me and said, "Margaret, what's going on? You don't seem like yourself lately." I almost told her everything right then. Almost broke down and confessed all my suspicions and fears. But I held back. What would I even say? My husband is acting weird and my sister is too friendly with him? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head. Instead, I told her I wasn't feeling well, which was true enough. Rita insisted I see another doctor, get a second opinion. She said I looked like I'd aged 10 years in the past few months and she was worried about me. I promised her I would, even though I doubted another doctor would find anything the first 3 hadn't. Then came the day that changed everything. I was in David's office again, this time looking for the warranty information for our refrigerator, which had stopped working. I opened his desk drawer and saw his old tablet, the one he'd replaced last year. On a whim I picked it up and turned it on. He'd never bothered to wipe it and it was still connected to his iCloud account, which meant it was syncing all his messages. My hands shook as I opened the Messages app. There were hundreds of texts between David and Claire. Hundreds. I scrolled back months and months of conversation. And there was everything. The affair. The plans. The timeline. All laid out in blue and gray bubbles on a screen. The affair had started almost immediately after Claire moved in. Maybe it had even started before, during those late-night phone calls when Claire was supposedly crying to David about her marriage. The messages were explicit. There were photos I had to quickly scroll past because seeing them felt like having my chest carved open with a dull knife. But worse than the affair were the other messages. The ones about me. Claire, she's getting worse. How much longer? David, doctor said the symptoms could take months to become fatal. We just have to be patient. Claire, I'm tired of waiting. I'm tired of pretending to care about her problems. David, I know, baby. Just a little longer. Once she's gone, we'll have everything. The house, the insurance money, her pension. And her stock options vest in 3 months when that drug gets approved. That's $2.3 million, Claire. We just have to wait. Claire, what if someone figures it out? David, they won't. The doctors think it's stress. Everyone thinks she's just working too hard. This is the perfect crime. I had to put the tablet down. I ran to the bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left. The perfect crime. They were killing me. My husband and my sister were slowly killing me, and they were talking about it like they were planning a vacation. I sat on the bathroom floor for I don't know how long, shaking, crying, trying to process what I'd just learned. Part of me wanted to run out of the house screaming. Part of me wanted to confront them right then and there. But some deeper instinct, some survival mechanism I didn't even know I had, told me to wait. To be smart. To think like the scientist I was. I went back to the office and took photos of every message. Hundreds of them. I documented everything on my own phone, saving it to a cloud account they didn't know about. Then I put the tablet back exactly where I'd found it and went to my bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed and forced myself to think clearly. They were poisoning me. But how? I thought about my symptoms. Chronic fatigue, nausea, dizziness, confusion, weight loss, the gray pallor of my skin. And then it hit me. In my line of work, I knew toxicology. I knew poisons. My symptoms were textbook arsenic poisoning. Chronic, low-dose arsenic poisoning designed to mimic natural illness. Arsenic. The poison of choice for centuries because it's tasteless, odorless, and in small doses mimics common illnesses. It would show up in my system, but unless someone specifically tested for it, it would be missed. And why would they test for it? I had no enemies. I had a stressful job and an understanding family. When I died, and I shuddered at how casually I thought that word, it would look like my heart had given out from stress or maybe a stroke or some undiagnosed condition. Natural causes. No one would question it. I thought about Claire's herbal teas. The ones she made for me every single evening, bringing them to me with a smile and a reminder to drink them while they were hot. The tea always had a slightly bitter taste, but herbal tea is often bitter, so I'd never questioned it. I'd trusted her. She was my sister taking care of me, and I'd drunk every drop like the fool I was. That evening I did something I should have done months ago. I took a sample of my own blood using supplies I had from my lab. It wasn't hard. I drew blood samples all the time for my research. I labeled it, stored it properly, and the next morning I took it to a private lab across town, one where no one knew me. I paid in cash and asked them to run a full toxicology screen, specifically checking for heavy metals. The wait for those results was the longest 3 days of my life. I had to pretend everything was normal. I had to sit across from David at breakfast and make small talk. I had to accept Claire's tea with a grateful smile, then pour it down the sink when she wasn't looking. I had to act like I didn't know that the two people I loved most in the world were actively working to kill me. When the results came back, I wasn't even surprised. Arsenic levels in my blood were elevated. Not immediately fatal, but definitely toxic. The lab technician who called me with the results sounded concerned, asking if I worked with arsenic in my job, if I'd been exposed to contaminated water. I made up a story about old pipes in my house and thanked him for the information. Now I had proof. Scientific, undeniable proof that I was being poisoned. But proof of what? That there was arsenic in my system, yes. But not proof of who was putting it there. Not proof that would hold up in court. I needed more. I needed to catch them in the act. I needed them to incriminate themselves so thoroughly that there would be no possibility of escape. I started chelation therapy on my own, using my medical knowledge to administer the treatment that would help remove the arsenic from my system. It was risky doing it without proper medical supervision, but I couldn't go to a doctor without explaining how I knew I was being poisoned. And if I did that, if I told anyone, David and Claire would know I was onto them. They'd stop. They'd disappear. They'd get away with it. But I needed them to think they were winning. I needed them to believe I was still the sick, trusting wife and sister who suspected nothing. So I continued to pretend my symptoms were getting worse, even as the chelation therapy was actually making me feel better. I'd stumble a little when I walked. I'd hold my head and wince. I'd tell them I was having trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating. And they'd exchange these quick glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Glances full of anticipation and something that looked almost like excitement. I installed hidden cameras throughout the house. Tiny ones, the kind designed for home security, that I ordered online and set up myself when I was supposedly at the doctor. I put one in the kitchen, pointed at the counter where Claire made my tea. One in our bedroom. One in the living room. One in the hallway. I saved all the footage to a cloud server, backing it up obsessively. And I watched. Oh, how I watched. I saw Claire adding the white powder to my tea, not even trying to hide it because she thought I was too sick to notice. I saw her and David kissing in the kitchen when they thought I was asleep. I saw them in our bed, the bed I shared with my husband while I was supposedly at work. I documented all of it. Every betrayal, every casual cruelty, every moment they thought they were getting away with murder. The messages on David's tablet continued. I checked them every few days and they became bolder, more confident. They were planning their future together. Talking about selling the house after I died, traveling to Europe, starting fresh somewhere new. Claire joked about finally getting to keep all my jewelry, not just borrow it. David talked about the life insurance policy, $500,000, that he'd taken out on me 6 months ago without my knowledge. 6 months. They'd been planning this for 6 months. Since before Claire even moved in. The divorce, I realized, had probably been fake or at least exaggerated. A convenient excuse to get Claire into my home, into my life, close enough to kill me slowly while playing the role of concerned sister. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a sudden decision made in anger. This was calculated, premeditated murder, planned by two people who looked me in the eye every single day and pretended to love me while they were feeding me poison. I found out about my stock options around this time too. The cardiac medication I'd spent years developing was about to get final FDA approval. When it did, my stock options, $2.3 million worth, would vest. I'd signed paperwork years ago that made David the beneficiary of everything if something happened to me. At the time it had seemed romantic. Now it was a death sentence. They were waiting for that approval to come through. Once I died after the options vested, David would get everything. The house, the insurance, the pension, the stock options. Millions of dollars. And all it cost was my life. I couldn't go to the police yet. I knew that. A good lawyer would tear apart what I had. The arsenic in my blood could have come from anywhere. The text messages were damning, but without context, a lawyer could argue they were taken out of context or misinterpreted. The cameras showed Claire putting something in my tea, but I'd have to prove it was poison. It would be my word against theirs, and they'd paint me as a paranoid, sick woman who'd fabricated everything. Oh, I needed more. I needed them to confess. I needed them to be caught so red-handed that there would be no possible defense. And slowly, carefully, a plan began to form in my mind. I invited David's parents, Robert and Helen, and my own mother, Joyce, for dinner. A family gathering, I told David and Claire. I wanted to try to feel normal again, to reconnect with the people who mattered. I picked a date 3 days out, giving them time to prepare. David looked nervous when I mentioned it, but he agreed. Claire went pale but forced a smile. They couldn't refuse without seeming suspicious. What I didn't tell them was that I'd overheard their conversation the night before. I'd been lying in bed, supposedly asleep, listening to them talk in hushed voices in the hallway. The family dinner made them nervous. They couldn't poison me with witnesses in the house. They decided they needed to give me a final dose the night before the dinner. Something stronger. Something that would ensure I'd have a heart attack or stroke before the family arrived. Claire's exact words, which I recorded on my phone: "She'll just look like she had a heart attack. With her work stress and all these health problems, everyone will believe it. The dinner will be the perfect cover. We'll call 911, crying and devastated, and no one will ever suspect." David's response: "Finally. Then we can start our real life together. No more pretending. No more waiting." Hearing those words, lying in the dark, knowing they were planning my death for the next evening, should have terrified me. And part of me was terrified. But another part of me was calm. Because I knew exactly what I was going to do. The next day I put my plan into motion. I called Rita, my lawyer friend, and told her everything. Every single detail. I showed her the videos, the text messages, the medical records showing the arsenic poisoning. I gave her copies of everything stored in multiple locations. I told her that if anything happened to me, she knew who to call and what to show them. She was horrified, furious, and immediately wanted to call the police. But I stopped her. I told her to wait just 24 hours. I promised her that by tomorrow night, I'd have enough evidence to put them both away for the rest of their lives. She didn't like it, but she trusted me. She made me promise to be careful, to call her if anything went wrong. I promised, even though I wasn't entirely sure I was doing the right thing. This could go wrong in so many ways. But I was tired of being the victim. Tired of being the one who trusted too much, who believed too easily. For once, I was going to be the one in control. That evening played out like a scene from a movie. I came home from work. My last day for a while. I told my boss I needed time off for health reasons, and acted particularly vulnerable. I told David and Claire that I'd been thinking about everything, about how paranoid and suspicious I'd been lately. I apologized. Can you imagine? I apologized to them for suspecting them of the very thing they were actually doing. I said I'd been unfair, that the stress and illness had made me irrational. I thanked them for being so patient with me. The relief on their faces was almost comical. They thought they'd convinced me. They thought they'd won. David hugged me, held me close, and told me he loved me. I felt his heart beating against my cheek and wondered how someone could be so cold. Claire squeezed my hand and said we were sisters. We'd always be sisters, and nothing would ever change that. That evening, Claire offered to make my special tea. She used those exact words, special tea, and I almost laughed at the dark irony. I said that would be lovely, that it always helped me sleep. I watched her go into the kitchen and I followed a minute later, pretending I wanted to chat. I stood in the doorway making small talk about the weather, about the dinner party tomorrow, while behind her back I watched her add the white powder to the cup. She added more than usual. Much more. In the hidden camera footage I reviewed later, you could see her hand shake slightly as she stirred it in, making sure it dissolved completely. She handed me the cup with a smile. I thanked her. David came into the kitchen then, and the three of us stood there, this twisted little family, while I held a cup of poison in my hands. They were both watching me, trying not to be obvious about it. I raised the cup to my lips, but then, "Oh, I need to add some honey," I said. "It's a bit bitter tonight." I set the cup down on the counter and went to get the honey from the pantry. It was a small pantry and I had to step inside to reach the shelf where we kept the honey. I was only out of their sight for maybe 10 seconds. But that was all I needed. When I'd prepared for this moment earlier in the day, I'd placed 2 identical cups in the pantry, hidden behind the cereal boxes where no one would notice them. One was empty. One contained tea I'd made myself, perfectly safe, no poison. In those 10 seconds I grabbed both cups, left the empty one in the pantry and brought the safe one out with me. It looked identical to the poisoned cup. Same white ceramic, same level of tea inside. 20 minutes later I clutched my chest and gasped. I let the cup fall from my hands, spilling tea on the carpet. I collapsed onto the floor, writhing, gasping for breath. My performance was Oscar-worthy. All those months of actually feeling these symptoms meant I knew exactly how to fake them. David and Claire rushed over. Their performance was pretty good too. David shouted my name, shook my shoulders. Claire cried out that she'd call 911. But here's the thing, I was watching them through half-closed eyes. And I saw the truth beneath the performance. I saw David check his watch. I saw Claire look at him questioningly. I heard her say, "Should I really call?" And I heard his response, so quiet I almost missed it. "Give it a few more minutes. Make sure." They were going to let me die. No, they thought they were watching me die. They stood over me, these 2 people I'd loved more than anyone in the world, and they watched me suffer. They waited to make sure I was really dead before they bothered calling for help. I lay there on that floor for what felt like hours but was probably only 5 minutes. It was the longest 5 minutes of my life. I had to control my breathing, had to make it look labored and irregular. Had to keep my eyes mostly closed while still watching them. Had to fight every instinct that wanted to jump up and scream at them. Finally, Claire said, "How long are we going to wait? What if someone saw her come home? What if a neighbor heard her fall?" David knelt down beside me, put his fingers on my neck to check my pulse. I'd slowed my breathing even more, made myself as still as possible. His fingers were cold on my skin. After a moment he said, "Oh, call now." And that's when I opened my eyes fully and sat up. You should have seen their faces. I wish I'd had a camera pointed at them instead of at me, because the absolute shock, the horror, the disbelief in their expressions was something I'll treasure forever. They stumbled backward. Claire actually screamed. David went white as a sheet. I stood up slowly, calmly. I brushed off my clothes. And then I pulled out my phone from my pocket where it had been recording everything. "Looking for these?" I said, and I played back the audio of their conversation. Their own voices filled the room. "Give it a few more minutes. Make sure." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the realization dawn on their faces. The understanding that they'd been caught. That I knew everything. "I know about the affair," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. "I know about the poison. I know about the life insurance, the forged mortgage, the plans to take my stock options. I know everything." David tried to speak but nothing came out. Claire burst into tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of fear. "I've been recording you for weeks," I continued. "I have cameras in every room of this house. I have documentation of the arsenic poisoning. I have copies of your text messages planning my murder. I have video of Claire adding poison to my tea tonight. I have witnesses who know everything and have copies of all the evidence. And I have this." I walked to the kitchen, into the pantry, and brought out the poisoned cup of tea still sitting where I'd left it. "This is the tea you made me, Claire. The one with enough arsenic to kill me tonight. I didn't drink it. I switched the cups. What I drank was perfectly safe tea I made myself this afternoon. But this," I held up the poisoned cup, "this is attempted murder. Premeditated, documented, undeniable." Claire sank to her knees, sobbing. David started toward me, and I saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. He was a big man, and I was alone with them in the house. For a moment I was genuinely afraid. But I held my ground. "Don't," I said. "Rita is outside in her car waiting for my signal. She has copies of everything. If I don't walk out that door in exactly," I checked my watch, "2 minutes, she's calling the police and showing them all the evidence. So unless you want to add actual murder to attempted murder, I suggest you stay right where you are." It was a bluff. Rita wasn't outside. But they didn't know that, and they couldn't take the chance. David stopped moving. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he stopped. That's when we heard the sirens. Actual sirens getting closer. Because Rita wasn't outside, but she had called the police. I'd texted her the signal the moment David said to wait before calling 911. She'd immediately called the police and reported an attempted murder in progress, giving them all the evidence I'd compiled. The look of betrayal on David's face when he realized I'd actually called the police might have been funny if the situation weren't so awful. He thought he was so smart, so clever. They both had. They'd thought they were pulling off the perfect crime, and instead, they documented their own guilt so thoroughly that there would be no possible defense. The police came through the door with their weapons drawn. I held up my hands and calmly explained who I was, that I'd made the report. I showed them my phone with the recordings. I pointed to the hidden cameras. I handed them the cup of poisoned tea, carefully preserved as evidence. I gave them the USB drives with copies of everything. Messages, videos, medical records. David tried to run. He actually tried to run out the back door, but there were officers there too. They tackled him in the backyard, handcuffed him while he shouted that this was all a misunderstanding, that I was crazy, that I'd fabricated everything. Claire just sat on the floor crying and saying, "I'm sorry," over and over again. But she wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she'd been caught. They arrested them both right there. Read them their rights while I stood in my living room, shaking with adrenaline and relief and grief. Because even though I'd caught them, even though justice was being served, I'd still lost everything. My marriage was a lie. My sister had tried to kill me. The life I'd built was gone. The police took my statement for hours. I showed them everything, every piece of evidence I'd collected, every recording, every document. They were thorough and professional, and they seemed genuinely shocked by the level of premeditation involved. One detective told me it was one of the most well-documented attempted murders he'd ever seen. He said my scientific training had probably saved my life, not just because I recognized the poisoning but because I'd known how to collect evidence that would hold up in court. They took the tea away for analysis. They took the hidden cameras. They took my phone and made copies of everything. They photographed the cameras, the kitchen, everything. My house became a crime scene and I stood in the middle of it, wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, watching my life being dissected and documented. Rita arrived while they were still processing the scene. She hugged me so hard I could barely breathe, crying and telling me I was insane for taking such a risk. But I'd lived. I'd survived. And David and Claire were in custody, facing attempted murder charges, conspiracy, fraud, and a dozen other charges the district attorney would pile on. The news spread quickly. By the next morning, my phone was flooded with messages from colleagues, friends, family members who'd heard what happened. David's parents called, horrified and apologetic, saying they'd had no idea. My mother was devastated about Claire, sobbing about how she'd raised her where she'd gone wrong. I had to comfort her even though I was the victim, because that's what you do when you're the eldest daughter, the responsible one. The family dinner I'd planned never happened, but the family gathered anyway. At the police station where we all gave statements. Robert and Helen, David's parents, looked like they'd aged 10 years overnight. They apologized to me over and over even though none of this was their fault. Helen held my hands and cried, saying she'd thought of me as a daughter, that she couldn't believe David would do something so evil. My mother couldn't even look at the police station. She sat in my living room, the crime scene that was now slowly being released back to me, and cried about Claire. About how close we'd been as children. About how she'd never seen any signs of this capacity for cruelty. She asked me questions I couldn't answer. When did Claire become this person? Had she always been capable of this? Did I think she ever really loved me? I didn't have answers. How do you reconcile the sister who braided your hair and defended you from bullies with the woman who spent months feeding you poison? How do you make sense of that kind of betrayal? The trial took 6 months to get to court. In that time I had to relive everything over and over. Depositions, evidence review, meetings with the district attorney. They built an ironclad case. The text messages alone were damning, but combined with the videos, the medical evidence, the forensic analysis of the tea that showed lethal levels of arsenic, and my own testimony, there was no defense. David's lawyer tried to argue that it was all Claire's idea, that she'd manipulated him, that he'd never actually intended to kill me. The text messages proved that was a lie. The videos of them together, planning their future, celebrating my declining health, showed exactly how involved he was. Claire's lawyer went for a sympathy play. Poor Claire, always in her sister's shadow, driven to desperation by years of jealousy. The prosecutor tore that argument apart. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was months of calculated murder attempts. This was greed, pure and simple. They wanted my money, my house, my life, and they were willing to kill me to get it. The trial itself was brutal. I had to sit in that courtroom and watch videos of my husband and sister together. I had to listen to them explain away their messages, their actions, their poisoning of me. I had to hear David's lawyer paint me as a controlling, career-obsessed wife who neglected her husband. I had to hear Claire's lawyer describe me as the golden child who'd made her feel worthless her entire life. But I also got to testify. I got to look at them sitting at their separate defense tables and tell the truth. All of it. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Morrison, listened carefully to every word. The jury, 8 women and 4 men, watched the videos without expression, but I could see the disgust in their eyes. The verdict came back in less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Both of them. Attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, forgery. The list went on and on. When the foreman read the verdict, David's face crumpled. He actually cried. Claire just stared straight ahead, her face blank. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. David got 15 years. The judge said his betrayal of his marriage vows, his forgery of my signature, and his leadership role in the conspiracy warranted a harsh sentence. Claire got 12 years. The judge acknowledged that she'd shown more remorse, genuine or not, but said that betraying a sister who'd always protected her was particularly heinous. 15 and 12 years. It didn't feel like enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. It was justice, even if it was cold comfort. Now here I am 6 months after the sentencing, and I'm finally starting to feel like myself again. The arsenic is completely out of my system. I quit my job at the pharmaceutical company. Too many memories, too many people who knew what happened. But my research team finished the cardiac medication and it got FDA approval. My stock options vested. I donated half the money to a foundation I started that helps victims of domestic poisoning. The other half is helping me build a new life. I moved to a new city. Fresh start, new house, new everything. I'm consulting now, working from home on my own schedule. I'm dating again, though slowly. Very slowly. Trust doesn't come easy anymore. But there's a man, Thomas, who's patient and kind and doesn't push. We'll see where it goes. Rita and I are closer than ever. She stuck with me through everything, and I'll never forget that. Real friendship, it turns out, is knowing who shows up when your life falls apart. I've made new friends too, people who know my story but don't define me by it. People who see me as Margaret, not as that woman whose husband and sister tried to kill her. My relationship with my mother is complicated. She's trying. She really is. But there's a distance between us now that wasn't there before. She lost both her daughters in a way. One to prison, one to trauma and necessary distance. We talk once a week. We're working on it. That's all I can say. David's parents send me cards sometimes. Apologizing again. Checking on me. I appreciate it even though I rarely respond. It's not their fault, but seeing their handwriting reminds me too much of seeing David's handwriting on those forged documents. I look back now and see all the red flags I missed. The way David always needed to be in control of our finances. The way Claire was just a little too interested in my daily routine. The way they'd both ask detailed questions about my work schedule, my health, my plans. At the time it seemed like care. Now I know it was surveillance. They were monitoring me, waiting for the perfect opportunity. But I also give myself grace. I was a good wife. A good sister. I loved them and trusted them, and there's no shame in that. The shame is theirs, not mine. They're the ones who betrayed that trust. They're the ones who chose greed over love, money over family. That's on them, not me. I want you to understand something, everyone watching this right now. Betrayal can come from anywhere. From the people you share your bed with. From the people who share your blood. And the signs aren't always obvious. Sometimes they're subtle. A second mortgage you didn't sign, a life insurance policy you didn't know about, symptoms that don't quite add up. Trust your instincts. Something feels wrong, investigate. Don't let people gaslight you into ignoring your own intuition. My scientific training saved my life. I recognized the symptoms of arsenic poisoning because I'd studied toxicology. I knew how to collect evidence because I'd spent years documenting research findings. But you don't need a PhD to protect yourself. You need to pay attention. You need to trust yourself. You need to believe that you're worth protecting. If you found this story powerful, if it resonated with you or made you think, hit that subscribe button right now. Join Auntie Anne's Tales family, where we share stories of survival, strength, and justice. Because these stories matter. Your story matters. David and Claire thought poison would be my end. They thought I was too trusting, too naive, too weak to fight back. They were wrong. The poison they gave me became my awakening. It opened my eyes to who they really were. It forced me to find strength I didn't know I had. It taught me that I could survive anything, even the worst betrayal imaginable. I'm not going to lie and say I'm completely healed. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still check my tea before I drink it, even though I live alone now. I still have moments where I wonder if I'll ever be able to fully trust anyone again. But I'm here. I'm alive. I'm building a life that's mine, not ours. And that's victory. So let me ask you something. What would you have done in my situation? When you discovered your husband and sister were poisoning you, would you have gone to the police immediately? Would you have confronted them? Or would you have done what I did? Gathered evidence, set a trap, and made sure they could never hurt anyone else again? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one and I want to hear what you think. The truth is, they didn't just try to kill my body. They tried to kill my spirit, my trust, my ability to love. And you know what? They failed. I'm still here. I still believe in good people even though I met two very bad ones. I still believe in love even though mine was betrayed. I still believe in family even though mine tried to murder me. Because letting them take that away would mean they won. And I refuse to let them win. I think about Claire sometimes, sitting in her prison cell. I wonder if she regrets it. Not the plan. I'm sure she regrets that it didn't work. But I wonder if she regrets losing me as a sister. If she remembers the good times we had before greed consumed her. If she lies awake at night thinking about how different her life could have been if she just asked me for help instead of trying to kill me. I'd have given her anything. She was my sister. I loved her. But she didn't want my help. She wanted my life. And David, I wonder if he thinks about me at all. If he regrets not just divorcing me like a normal person. If he realizes that 15 years in prison isn't worth any amount of money. If he understands that he threw away a woman who loved him unconditionally for a woman who helped him commit murder. They'll both get out eventually. Claire will be 50 when she's released. David will be 57. They'll have served their time, paid their debt to society. But they'll never get back what they lost. Their reputations, their freedom, their futures. All gone because they couldn't be satisfied with what they had. I, on the other hand, have everything I need. Not everything I wanted. That life is gone forever. But I have peace. I have safety. I have a future that's mine to build however I want. I have the knowledge that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. And I have my story which I'm sharing with you now, hoping that maybe it helps someone else recognize the signs before it's too late. Because that's the thing about betrayal. It thrives in silence. It counts on you being too embarrassed to admit something's wrong, too loyal to investigate, too loving to believe the worst. It counts on your goodness, your trust, your humanity. And the only way to fight it is to speak up, to pay attention, to believe yourself when your instincts scream that something's wrong. My name is Margaret Chin. I'm 43 years old. I'm a pharmaceutical researcher, a survivor, and a woman who refused to let poison, either the literal kind or the metaphorical kind, destroy her. My husband and my sister planned to kill me for money. They almost succeeded. But I was smarter, stronger, and more determined than they ever imagined. I turned their plan against them, and now they're the ones suffering the consequences while I'm here, free, building a life they can never touch again. They thought I was the perfect victim. Trusting. Loving. Naive. They were wrong. I was the perfect survivor. And if you're watching this, dealing with your own betrayal, your own toxic situation, your own moment of realizing that someone you love is hurting you, please hear this. You are stronger than you think. You are smarter than they believe. You can survive this. You can thrive after this. Don't let anyone's poison, literal or figurative, be your end. Let it be your awakening. Thank you for watching this story. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, justice delayed is not justice denied. Sometimes it's just justice getting all its evidence in order. Subscribe to Auntie Anne's Tales for more stories of survival, strength, and the triumph of truth over deception. Because your story isn't over. It's just beginning.